one of my articles before I was bringing the notion of toxic neutrality, and I think this is what we are dealing with now. So international media trying, deliberately or not, to present the issue in the most neutral manner as it possible. And I find it harmful, simply, because I believe that we have to use the analytical tools that we have to understand the situation better. And this is what technically international media are for. I think that the notion of Orientalism in Europe basically says that conflict is inevitable. It's in the nature of the East. So there will be always conflicts in the Caucasus, there will be always conflicts in the Middle East. There is nothing to do about that, because somehow people in these places cause conflicts. And I do find that narrative quite common, actually, not only among European people, but also among European journalists and politicians. And this is the legacy of 150 years of how Europe was perceiving this specific region and how it shaped the image of it. And again, I'm very upset, I have to confess, that there is very little attempt to actually break that narrative and to look at it in a realistic way, in a constructive way, not just saying that this is just another conflict in the East. Certain aspects of the conflict, which is the treatment of civilians, the prisoners of war, the role of Turkey, these aspects have been continuously downplayed in the international media and international politics for the past 2 years. And I think the global hypocrisy that we experienced in 2020 has somehow normalized the view that military aggression is a way to solve a diplomatic dispute. And the consequences of it we see today with Armenian territory being invaded. Obviously, speaking about international media coverage, the level of discourse around this situation is extremely low. Currently, only when the headline is right and the geography is right, we already consider that a success. This is how low the discourse has become. What quite often comes in international media is that Azerbaijan only responds to provocations. If you really look at what happened in the past 30 years, you will understand that Armenia has never benefited from any border clashes of any violence on the border. And the main Armenian strategy was to sustain status quo in relative peace. So this border clashes and provocations narrative is, in this case, highly misleading, because you have to take into account the disproportion between Armenia and Azerbaijan in population, in resources, in political influence. And obviously, if you take these factors into consideration, you will notice that Armenia has absolutely no interest in provocation. The main interest of Armenia currently is to keep the situation as stable as it's possible. And not only that it misinforms, but also it probably contributes to continuous violence. A lot of political analysis around the conflict currently is focused on what Azerbaijan wants. Is it the transport route? Is it the Nagorno-Karabakh? So I see a lot of intellectual effort being put into understanding what's the agenda, what's the purpose. And I think, again, we are losing the right perspective. So from my perspective, it doesn't matter what Azerbaijan wants. Whatever it wants, 200 people have already died for it. So at which stage we can say that it's enough? Khojaly is being brought with kind of intensity, obviously by Azerbaijani side, and we have to be clear that this somehow was parallel. So for Khojaly massacre, you can bring up Megara village massacre conducted by Azerbaijani soldiers on Armenian population. For all the refugees, Azeri refugees from Karabakh, you can bring the Armenian refugees from Baku. And if you read anthropological studies looking, for example, at Armenian refugees from Baku, obviously they were also a victim of that conflict, because adaptation to living in Armenia after they were born and raised in Baku and they considered Baku their home was extremely difficult. So I still think that the amount of suffering and damage that has been done to the regular population is equal on both sides. However, we cannot fix it by continuous spiral of violence. There has to be a step that is able to break that cycle. Azerbaijan quite often brings 4 resolutions of the UN Security Council that were made in the 90s, and I see people constantly referring to these resolutions, including recently, for example, Al Jazeera, bringing them again and discussing them. And I think to really fully refer to these resolutions, we have to understand the context in which they were created. So that time in the 90s, the overall strategy was to maintain stability over the former Soviet Union. And as Gorbachev has stated himself, there were 18 potential points of inflammation throughout the territory of former USSR. So the policy was to maintain that stability, knowing that all these borders have been delimited in the colonial context, with ethnical circumstances being largely ignored. So at that time, no one really wanted to deal. That was the thinking that guided the United Nations Security Council in the 90s. We have to understand that Azerbaijan itself already has violated 3rd and 4th resolution, because they clearly say that any issues related to Karabakh conflict has to be solved only within the Minsk group. So this obviously has been violated in 2016, in 2020, and again is being violated today. So bringing these resolutions today, 30 years later, is not really valid, and I don't think it's actually productive, because it doesn't bring us any closer to understanding, and it doesn't bring us any closer to solution. And we have to understand that there is no such thing as a frozen conflict. There have been development in Azerbaijan over the last 30 years, for example, affecting the entire generation with the hate against Armenians. And obviously there have been developments of Armenian side. These are now on these lands, there is entire population being raised that was born in Karabakh. The European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, that was alarming already 2016. And they were directly talking about state-sponsored hate about Armenians. So we have to look at the situation now as it is, now how it was in the 90s. And what we are facing today is that any border change within the Karabakh will cause absolute humanitarian crisis. And we have to be very clear about the fact that Armenians cannot at this moment live under Azerbaijani rule. It's absolutely impossible. We have to understand that Azerbaijan is a predatory state also against own citizens. And what fate is gonna be faced by the most hated ethnic minority in Azerbaijan? We are talking about 150,000 people who are possibly in danger. There are also Azerbaijani activists which are very openly against the war. One of them, Ahmed Mamadli, just being arrested in Baku a couple of days ago. So there are people who somehow do not share that attitude, but on the state level, and we have to always distinguish between people level and the state level, on the state level, Azerbaijan celebrates violence against Armenians, and obviously one proof of it is that museum that was opened in Baku 2 years ago, but also the popularity of the videos of war crimes being committed on prisoners of war and of civilians. One thing that did change, in fact, was obviously the recent visit of Nancy Pelosi in Armenia. That has sent very strong message, and obviously more of such messages are needed. However, Nancy Pelosi was asking how United States can support Armenia, and I think the first stop to do so is to immediately enforce Section 907 of Freedom Support Act and stop any aid to Azerbaijan. And just to remind, only between 2016 and 2017, United States provided Azerbaijan with over $800 million of aid. 1/7 of it, roughly, was spent on military aid. And what's the justification of that? This aid has been provided to boost economy. I mean, the only way to boost the economy in Azerbaijan is to stop accumulating wealth in the authoritarian regime. So obviously, our Azerbaijani people are not benefactors of this aid, and directly it supports the authoritarian regime in Azerbaijan. Well, interestingly, Karabakh hasn't been mentioned by Nancy Pelosi even once during her visit, and I was specifically putting attention to that. I guess we have to be very clear that any further border change within Karabakh will cause mass displacement and potentially harm to 150,000 people. And this aspect of Azerbaijani hate towards Armenians has been also quite ignored and downplayed in international coverage. While already in 2011, the European Commission Against Racism as Intolerance was alarming that the state-sponsored hate against Armenians in Azerbaijan is just extreme. That's why it's absolutely impossible for these people to live under Azerbaijani rule. It's going to bring mass humanitarian crisis. And, well, you know, the concept of land that is quite often brought by international media, I think that land is equally tangible and abstract as a concept. So we have to move somehow from the idea of land as a resource to land as people who inhabit it. And that's why I believe that the only ethical solution looking at the values of 21st century is the Nagorno-Karabakh independence.